Hello and welcome to my lecture on PHP Object-Oriented Programming. So PHP is a very early language, as we've talked about before. Is built in the 90s, right when the web was coming out, and as a result it was very crude, and object-oriented programming just didn't seem like a necessary thing. And that object-oriented programming is something that computer scientists and languages like Java and C++, they really love object-oriented programming. And for a while, PHP just thought that wasn't something that was necessary for the simple kinds of things that we're going to build in PHP. But with PHP 5, PHP is becoming more of a serious language, and a language that people are going to use to do professional, scalable things. And as applications get more and more complex, if you go from hundreds of lines of code to thousands of lines of code to 1 million lines of code, you really need mechanisms like object-oriented programming to organize what it is that you're going to do. So in PHP 5, object-oriented support is very nice, and it's very good. And increasingly, as these large frameworks are being built in PHP 5, they're using object-oriented programming. And so if you go back to non-object-oriented programming, you basically tend to have this notion that there's code and that there's data. So you got some variables and you got some like if statements and stuff like that, and that they are separate. And that's the non-object-oriented way. There's algorithms and data. The object-oriented way are these things, these objects that themselves encapsulate both code and data. We call the code inside of objects methods, and we call the data fields. And so we need some words to describe how object-oriented programming works. We use the word class to describe a template of an object, right? So we're saying all objects of this category have these general capabilities. And then we can make many of those objects, and each of those objects is then an instance, right? So we say, okay, here is a template, and we're going to make it, 40 of these things. And then a method is just a defined bit of capability inside. And so here is the definition from Wikipedia, and it's really defining the characteristics that will be common across all instances of the object. All this terminology is kind of self-referential, right? A class is a template for all of the instances. An instance is a particular copy of a live real variable. And so it's sort of a pattern. It's like a cookie cutter. It's not the cookie, it's the cookie cutter. And an instance is actually like a variable. It's a place where we can put code and data. We have code and we can put data in, and we have many instances, right? Many cookies once we make the cookie cutter template that shapes these instances. A method is a bit of code within a class that's also within an instance. It'll probably be easier just to start looking at code and seeing how this works. So if you look at PHP code from a long time ago, PHP code from a long time, you see a very non-object oriented sort of strategy inside this code. And what happens is, to organize ourselves when all of the functions for date and time, for example, are global, we tend to come up with a scheme by which we prefix them. So we put the word date underscore after a while. We get organized and say, look, there's a lot of date related functions. So we'll just put date underscore, and these means the functions get really long. And the notion of create is a concept that we understand, that we might create a date, or we might create a network connection, or we might create a whatever. And so we have to name these things date underscore create. And you can see how this gets a little annoying after a while, because you have to sort of pick a prefix, and then all these functions are global functions. If we take a look at sort of the object-oriented view of this thing, we have a class, and it's a way of namespacing the concept of create. So we have a thing called create, but it's within a date-time class. Okay, it's within a date-time class. And so we can have methods. We can have a create method within datetime, the datetime class. And so it's a way of grouping functionality. Sometimes it's just kind of like library code, and other times there are sort of many instances of these things that we create. And so if we were to take a look at a bit of code, and in this little date.php sample code that I've got, you will see that we have all these things where the prefix is date. The prefix is, time, date. And what we do in the object-oriented approach is we say, okay, let's make a new. New is a piece of the PHP language. It's a reserved word. New says, take this template from the date time template and copy the template, make me a variable that has all the things that are expected to be from that template, and give it to me in the variable now. So we have this is making an instance. And in that instance, we have both data and code, basically. The methods and the fields are there, okay? And we can pass into this step right here is called the constructing step. We are constructing, we do have two of them. We have now and next week are two variables, and we're going to have two instances of the date time object, and there's some parameters that you can put in, and you can read all the documentation as to what you're allowed to put in this date time construction. And so then what we do is we have method calls, and if this $now is an object and format is a method in the class, we use this minus greater than sign, which is really just kind of an arrow. It's our way of kind of constructing an arrow. It's really a single operator. It's not a two operators. It's here is an object and here is a method within that object, and this is sort of the method lookup bit. Okay? And so now we have things like the word format, which the word format might be useful to all kinds of things. There might be format of this, format of that, but this is a way for us to have a format method within the date time object and namespace those nicely. Now, that's how we would use an object that somebody else defined for us. We would go read the documentation for the date time thing and say, okay, we want to do this too. We want to make our own object, okay? And so here is sort of a non-object oriented concept of some fields, right? Where we're going to make an array and we're going to have two fields in it. One is full name or family name, given name, and room. And here are two kind of people objects, but it's really just arrays, right? They're not objects really. But we have a situation where sometimes we have a person's full name, sometimes we have a family and their given name, and we just want to be able to make it so we can find out what the person's display name is. And so we have this convention that says we'll have things of this kind of type of people-like things that may have a full name or may have a family name and a given name. And we'll create this little global function called getPersonName, and we'll pass one of these two things in, and it'll check to see if there's a person, a full name for the person, and return that. And if we have a family name and a given name, we return concatenation of the given name and the family name together. So we can take this thing, there's a Chuck thing and a Colleen thing, and if you do getPersonName Chuck and then getPersonName Colleen, we can print out Chuck Severance, who has a full name, and Colleen Van Lent. And this is the notion of, if you didn't see this part right here, you didn't know about that, it's like, oh, it's pretty magical. I can have these two things that are kind of variants of one another, and look at that. I have this nice little routine that hides the detail of how this stuff is actually stored internally. But that's not an object-oriented approach. That's kind of doing object-like things where you have some internal structure and internal data and some conventions that you sort of know because you're the one that wrote the code, and then some code that handles that internal convention. Now, if we take a look at the same kind of thing, if we were to do this, we would say, you know what, let's make ourselves a class, and let's call it the person class. And let's put some variables in the class. In the previous example, they were strings, but let's put some variables in the class. We have the full name, the given name, the family name, and a room, which are all public variables, which means they can be accessed outside the class. And then we have a function called getName, which is really a method within the person class. And then we see this thing called this. This means the class itself is a template. Remember, it's a cookie cutter, it's not the cookies. We don't make an actual person until we instance it. And we're going to have two of them. One's going to be $Chuck and the other's going to be $Colleen. And there's going to be a copy of full name, family name, given name, and room for Chuck, and there's going to be a copy because it takes a full copy of the template and then makes the object. Copy of the full name, given name, family name, and room for the Chuck variable, right? And then one for the Colleen variable. But when we're in the function getName, which is a method, we need to know which one we're in. And we use this thing called this. Now this is effectively a constant, right? It's a fixed little thing. I don't know, we'd call it a constant or reserved word or whatever it is. This means when there are many objects out there, this is the one we're currently in. It's probably easier when we look down here and look at the code, right? So here we're going to make a Chuck object. New, remember new is part of PHP that says go take this class, read through it, sort of clone it, and give me back an instance of that class, and I'm going to stick that in the variable Chuck. So Chuck is an object. It's of type object. And because this is public, full name is public, I can say Chuck full name is Chuck Severance. And Chuck room equals that. And here's Colleen. I make another person, so there's now two variables, one variable named Colleen, one variable named Chuck, and we set her family name and her given name and her room number. And then I can call the get method inside of Chuck. Now you'll notice there's no parameters to this. And that's because, in effect, this $Chuck is an implicit parameter that becomes $this. So when I'm calling this one, $this is $Chuck. And when I call this, then $this is $Colleen. So $this is always the current object that we're in. And so getName will do different things when it's called from the Chuck object versus the Colleen object. Hope that makes sense. So you will have to take a look at PHP documentation, because the first thing that you're going to do is actually use PHP objects, some that I'll have created in my Tsugi framework, some that will be right from PHP. And so if we take a look at the datetime documentation from PHP, we'll see some things. The first thing we'll see is const. And these are constants that are part of the class. And we reference these constants. So we use the name of the class followed by double colon, datetime, double colon, RFC822, which pulls us right into this object right here. So that says in the class datetime, go find a constant or static bit of code. That's what this lookup is. This is something that's part of the class. And so that way we can look in here and find this RFC822. So if you're reading documentation and you want this constant, which happens to be a format string, how to make an RFC822 date. And that's useful, whatever. But for now we're not using it. We're just showing that we can pull this constant out of this class using this double colon syntax. Okay, so the other thing to look for is a method called __ construct. This is a specially named method that is the code that's called whenever new happens. And you can see the parameters, what you can put in to this in the parentheses when you're doing the constructor call are basically here, right? It's like, oh, okay, here are some optional things. I can have a string, a time string, and a time zone. And they're all optional. And so you can basically, by looking for the __ construct, you can see the calling sequence. You can see the calling sequence of this thing right here. Okay, so this is the new. In effect, the new operator is the __ construct. And you can also, if you see something that's static, static is a method that's part of the class and common across all instances. There are not static things like setDate, which you use the arrow to get at. If you find a static method, you can get at that static method with the double colon operator. Okay, so you get at the static method with the double colon operator. Okay, so if you see static, that means that you can just use that without having an instance of the class. An object. You don't need an object. It's also part of all objects as well, but it can be used standalone say, I want to go in this class and I want to run the method. It's not that different than these constants where you say, go in the class, grab that constant. This is go in the class, run that code. So you will see code being called sometimes from an instance variable with the minus sign greater than, and sometimes you'll see code being called, this is kind of like library code. Yeah, library code. Okay? And so what we have here is we have a regular old non-static method, right? Public string format. This is telling you return type, it's a string return and it has the parameters. And this is a normal one where we actually have to have an instance. And so here's the class. The new operator makes us an instance of the class and puts it in the variable z. And then we call format on an instance with this minus greater than operator. And you can see, go read the documentation. It says what the legitimate things are to put inside that format string. And so we got your static things, we got your constructor, and then we have sort of a non-static method. There's a whole bunch of other stuff that I'm not going to go into in great detail. And if you're familiar with object-oriented programming, in many ways, PHP had some real advantages because it invented its own object-oriented patterns later than languages like C++ and even earlier languages like Simula. And so we've had a lot of experience. And so in addition, the PHP lifecycle of objects is actually in ways more sophisticated than the object lifecycle in languages like C++ and Java. And the set, state, and wake up are examples of things where we're putting things in session for a long term, and you can write code inside of your object that is triggered at these moments where objects are put to sleep and woke up. Don't worry about this in particular. Just know that PHP objects are kind of cool, and in some ways might surprise you, even if you know object-oriented programming in other languages. You know, it's pretty impressive actually. So, mentioning the object lifecycle, and I already talked about the constructor, right? And so, but it's important to sort of really understand how object lifecycle works, right? So we have a class, which is a cookie cutter template, and that makes it so that we can make as many objects or instances as we want. We have special methods or code that get called at the moment of creation, the moment of destruction, and on that previous slide, there's other events that happen to objects that we can sort of plug ourselves into at that particular moment. So constructors are used a lot because they set up data and we use them a lot. So, but destructors are rarely used. It's very, like they might have a database connection or some kind of a socket or something in them. So we don't worry too much about it. So we really focus on constructors, but we'll talk about both. So like I said, the constructor sets up the initial state of variables when the new operation happens. And so what I've got here is a very, very simple bit of code that does absolutely nothing. Actually does something, but it does absolutely nothing except echo statements to give us a sense of this life cycle. Okay, and so we have a constructor, specially named method, and a destructor, which is a specially named method, and then we have just a regular old method that we've named for ourselves. Okay, and so if we take a look at this, we're going to see that. This class does absolutely nothing, right? And so the template, PHP remembers the template. That's all this does. Is like later we might make some of these things, and here's what they're supposed to look like if we're going to make them. So that's why the first echo that comes out is 1. Nothing's been constructed, but then we call new, and we put the resulting object in party animal, and that triggers the call of the constructor. Now we don't have any parameters in here, and we don't have any parameters in here. If we wanted to put parameters, we would put them to the constructor, we would put them there, and then we'd be required to put them here. So these two things are correlated. But we're not going to do that right now. We just are going to it gets constructed, the new causes this code to run, and so out comes constructed for the first one. And then we print out 2, right? And then we construct another one and stick it in the variable y, which causes the template to be read and copied again, and the constructor to be called. And so number 2 is constructed, and then we print out the string 3, and then we call something in X, which prints out the word something, and then we print out the end. Okay, so we print out the end, and then the program stops. There's nothing else in this program, okay, except that PHP is cleaning things up after our program's done, and it is calling the two destructors. Not always guaranteed the order in which they get called, but it will call the destructors to get rid of them. And so even after the end of the program, it's like, ooh, clean that up, clean that up, clean that up. This is a thing where you, to the extent that you want to do it, you can affect the life cycle to say, I want to be called when you're throwing me away. That's really what this underscore underscore destruct is. Right before you throw me away, call me. Now, I'm not doing anything. It's not common, but you can see how we can build objects that jack into the creation and then later destruction of these objects and say, run my code at that point in time. We don't know why yet. We're not going to make a lot of these objects. We just have to kind of understand them at this point. So like I said, the class is a template, and we make many, many, many objects, and each instance has its own copy of instance variable, unless, of course, they're static. So here's a class, and we actually introduced a concept called protected. We've been playing with public stuff, and protected is variables that can't be accessed using this method, this little reference, this greater than reference, outside the class. And so it's a way to protect the value from sort of the outside. And it makes it so we can only change it inside the class. And so it means that this variable is only accessible inside the class. Now, we can put a parameter on the constructor, which means we're passing in the string quote ES quote on the constructor. We add a parameter here. And then remember, this is the current instance, this lang. We're allowed to access this variable inside the class because we're inside the class right now. And that lang is taking this variable coming in. And so that way we can get this lang to be ES, but we can only change it, meaning it can't be changed out here. And then we can say greet, and it looks for this thing. And so this is like, it's all locked in this class, right? It's protected from the outside world, which means it can be used by all the methods in the class, but it can't be used out here. Which means it's a way to say, hey, outside world, I'm going to make this class called hello, and I will let you pass this in on constructor, but I don't want you changing it the rest of the time. And this is a very simple example, but you can kind of see how you might want variables that the class owns and controls. So, we talked about class, which is a template, method, sometimes they'll be called messages, it's a capability. They have objects and instances, can have many of those, which is a sort of a copy. They take the cookie cutter and go and then make a cookie, lots of cookies. And constructor is a method that's called at the beginning. So we got all that. Let's talk a little bit about inheritance. We can make a new class that is a derived class that adds capabilities or overrides capabilities in an existing class. And we call this inheritance because we have an animal and then we're going to make a dog, but the dog has all the things that animals have. And so and then some more, or we can slightly override it. So another term for this inheritance is what's called subclasses. Subclasses are, classes that inherit attributes, so it's a subclass. So here we go. Now this is getting a little bit tricky, and you're not going to have to do too much of this, so don't worry about this. A lot of this is terminology, so that if you see something as you're looking at code that someone else perhaps has written, you'll recognize what's going on. So we're going to have this class, the hello class from before, right? And we're going to make a new class called social that understands both how to greet and how to say goodbye. And so we're going to say make us a new class called social and extends, part of PHP, extends the hello class, which means we're pulling everything that's in hello, including the constructor, including protected lang, and including the greet method. That's all coming into social, and we're adding this by function. And the by function looks at this lang, right? It can see it because it's inside, right? And it can say goodbye now and returns it. So if we create a new social class, this calls actually the constructor. Let me clear that up, it's getting a little sloppy. So when we call social, social doesn't have a constructor, but it inherited the constructor from hello. And so it's using hello's constructor. And that constructor puts the language into the $lang. $lang is actually part of social. We just don't have to say it because we've extended it. We've inherited all the capabilities. Then we can call the greet function, which will print out hola. And then, because that's coming from the parent function and the parent class, and then we call by. Again, it's getting a little sloppy. Greet comes from the inherited class, and then by comes from social. So you can make hello objects and you can make social objects. Social objects have everything that hello objects have, plus the ability to say goodbye. And so that's the notion why we call it the word extends. It starts with hello and then adds a bunch of stuff to it. So now we've talked about inheritance, which is the ability to make a class, make a new class, starting with an old class and extending it. And one thing I sort of glossed over a bit is this visibility. And when you're in a class and you're making class variables, you can say that this variable is a public variable, which means that code outside can touch it, outside the class. Protected means only code inside and the derived classes can touch it. And private means only inside but not in the derived classes. Okay, so here's just a nice simple example of that. So we have three things. We have a public, they just are keywords here. So you say public, protected, and private. I mean, I just made mnemonic variables, so don't get confused about that. So inside this class, I can see all the public, protected, and private. So if I so I make a class, I can look at the public variable, and that comes out. And it would be a syntax error if I tried to touch the protected or private variables, right? Because out here I'm outside the class. In here I'm inside the class. Here I'm outside the class. Okay. But if I call print hello, I mean this blows up. These two blow up, so they're not going to work. But if I call print hello, it can access all three of them. Okay. And if I did an extended class, added to all that I just did, that said my class 2 extends my class, and if I did print hello in there and I tried to echo the public and the protected variables from the parent class, it would work, and it would fail as I looked at that private variable. So sometimes, that's your public, protected, and private. Sometimes you will see code where they will actually build a class from scratch. This is not highly recommended, but it's also something that was done in the transition from kind of partially object-oriented to more object-oriented, and I just want to show it to you in case you see it. And so there is the new operation, and then there's this class called the standard class, which is built into PHP. It's always there. And then we can actually just populate it by variables. So it creates an empty class with no methods, no fields, and then by whatever it is that you start putting into it, you can create things, right? And so it's not that different than making a class, defining it, and then setting things away we go. So the point being is this standard class is an object, okay? And it's a way to make an object and then fill it with things. Okay, so now I want to talk a little bit more about namespaces and frameworks. I mean, the whole thing that we really are talking about is a way of managing code as code size grows. A way of managing code as code size grows. And PHP is becoming increasingly sophisticated, and there are larger and larger code libraries out there, things like Symfony and Drupal and whatever. And it's getting to the point where a project like Drupal wants to use a package, I think, like Symfony, and these things tend to crash into each other because they all want to make an object called person, for example. And so they can't create a global variable name $person because they would all. So object-oriented programming allows us to kind of like namespace functions within classes and namespace variables within classes. But even now we need a deeper namespace so that everyone can have a class called person. So there could be multiple user classes or person classes or whatever to keep these large code bases from stepping on one another. And so if you go to this website called phpfig.org, Framework Interoperability Group is what FIG stands for. It's kind of a cute name. This is where these organizations that are building large PHP frameworks get together and fight through and argue about best practice so they can stay out of each other's way. Or so that you or I can write an application that includes more than one framework, and by adding two frameworks together, you don't break them both. And so that's the whole idea of this Framework Interoperability Group, and it's a convention for using namespaces. So let's talk a bit about namespaces. Oh, here's all the folks in the Framework Interoperability Group. And here's some of the Framework Interoperability Group standards. You can read these things. They're kind of sophisticated, but that's okay. So the OO in general allows us to avoid these clashes for global function names, but we want to avoid clashes on class names. So that if I create a class name user, I want there to be multiple users. And so you can take a look at the use of this. I follow in my Tsugi software, I follow this convention. And there's a naming convention for where you put these files in your hierarchy. And you put these in live, vendor, and then your project name, and then you get to name anything you want here, and then you get to name your class anything you want. So you have these kind of like 3 layers of names. And not that you have to follow the PHP Framework Interoperability Group rules, but I am following the Framework Interoperability Group's rules. There is a function inside PHP called namespace that basically says within this file, all the classes that I create or reference are going to be prefixed in a sense with /sugi/core. Okay, so /sugi/ the real class name is /sugi/core and then /user. Okay, so this is basically a way to have these longer names where this is the Framework Interoperability Group, where the first one is the project, the second one is kind of group within project, and then the third one's the actual class. And then this has to correspond, according to the Framework Interoperability Group, with a particular naming convention in the path. Okay, but namespace is just a general idea to basically make it so you can make these longer names. Now the interesting thing is, once you have declared that you are in a namespace in the file, all the classes that you reference, like datetime, which is actually a PHP global class, would be looked for to be in Sugi core datetime. And so you have to add this / to go all the way up to datetime, to go all the way up to the top. Datetime is at the top. And so once you switch a code from not using namespaces to using namespaces, you'll have to find a few little places usually where you've got to add this / to get back up. Like std class is another example that's in the global namespace, and you got to put a / on that std class to find it. So the namespace basically says, in this file, I want all the classes that I'm defining and that I refer to have this namespace, and if I want to get out of that namespace, I can put a / or I can put a fully qualified name in as the class. And we'll talk in a second how you do this. And so if you're going to access a class somewhere else that's got a namespace to it, and it's this long name, you could basically say, you know, I want to make a new user, right? And I want to make a new user, Sugi core user. That's its fully qualified namespace. Okay? Now, if you had a bunch of places in the code where you're doing this over and over and over again, this would become annoying. And so there's another keyword in object-oriented PHP that basically says use. And that says, go find this global class, and I can refer to it by just its name. Okay? So it's like an import. If you're familiar with Java, this is like an import statement if you're from Java. But if you're not from Java, ignore what I just said. It's like this class is out there, it's got this global name, I want to use it locally, I'm going to use it a bunch of times in this file, so I'm going to call this use statement. Use is a directive that's PHP that says, go find this global one and let me refer to it as a thing. You can actually have an as on here if you want and tell it what local class name that you want to have in addition. And so the namespace helps in the creation, and the use helps in the accessing of these things. So you tend to use the namespace in the page that is making the class, or the file that's making the class, and you use in files that access the class. So you tend to use namespace once and use all over the place. That's for convenience. This all ends up with what's called an autoloader. You can either require all of the PHP code, the class code. Oops. You can require them, and if you look in my little Tsugi Lib LMS PHP, you see a ton of requires. This is very kind of classic PHP, where you don't have too much code, and you're likely going to use all of your classes on every request response. So you just say, bring them all in, right? I need them all. Probably need them all. But there's such a thing if you had something that was so large that you might only use 5% of the code, you might want to do a dynamic loading of that. And so if you name your classes the right way and you put one class in a file and you make your folder names the right way according to the Framework Interoperability Group, then you don't have to actually load them. You just try to create them, and the new statement actually throws an exception that your autoloader catches, and then it goes and loads the class as you need it when you need it. So it's really sort of a way, and it's all documented here in the Framework Interoperability Group. And the larger these frameworks get, the more important autoloading is for those frameworks. And part of the goal of the Framework Interoperability Group is get to the point where you have one autoloader, or any autoloader from any framework will be able to autoload the classes from any other framework. And that's why it's important to do that. You're probably not going to write a lot of code that does this. It's just you're going to run into frameworks and you're going to hear about this, and it's important that you have some understanding of how these frameworks work. And so one of the things that you get from this is you have these expected names. I want to make a new Tsugi core user, and the autoloader, any autoloader, will look in the particularly named file and find it. And it's kind of a one-to-one correspondence, and it also has the rule that you're supposed to only have one class in a file. So a class named user will be in that user.php, and a class named context will be in context.php. And you won't make one thing called, Tsugi objects that have a user, context, and settings defined all in them. You have to keep them separate. So there's all these rules, and I think they're really good best practices. And you will sort of be digging through code, and you're like, oh, there it is. It looks just like what I saw in that class, in that course. Okay, so PHP is in a neat transition from non-object-oriented programming to object-oriented programming. Global function names are verboten, especially if you're building frameworks or using frameworks. We group the data and the functionality together in an object. We can have as many methods named create as we like. We got all kinds of things like public, private, and protected, which is really cool. And then even we go from global functions to functions within classes or methods within classes. And then it's like, oh, wait, we can't have global classes either because this is getting too complex. And again, all this is very common in languages like C++ and Java, and it's coming to PHP as PHP becomes an increasingly serious language. Thanks.